Thank you very much, Victor. Thank you very much, Blanca, for the opportunity to be part of this research project and also for being here and take part in the meeting to share some reflections that I hope are interesting. I'll try to be as brief as possible. I have my timer set so that I stick to time, and we have some time for the discussion later and the reflection and experience sharing, because that's what we want to do. We're part of a research group. We're studying identity and the need to overcome a sex-gender binarism and those binary patterns in society. And I think that's what's interesting is that we can also share a point of view and enrich at the same time the point of view of other people. I've decided to focus on the right to freedom of expression as a fundamental right, and the way in which binary exclusion and the discrimination Lara was mentioning a few minutes ago, how this is transmitted through new channels and communication platforms and general platforms for speech. And many times speech becomes hate speech through these messages. I will start presenting a general framework with some examples of discursive aggression. Then I will be discussing the most important topics that are seen from a constitutional perspective. And then I'll also mention the new channels that we are using
de los discursos y en general
and how this kind of speech is disseminated, because I think that these new channels and these new platforms are also key when we try to see the needs to rethink the framework that we are going to be using for freedom of expression. And I will conclude with some case law comments regarding hate speech as a limit to freedom of expression, and the reflection that I will leave for the discussion, if we have time, around the need to redraft this legal framework that we use in terms of communication and freedom of speech. In line with what Lara Martinez was mentioning at the beginning of this session, I have to go back to the importance of communication. Human beings are social, we need to relate to one another, we need to interact, and communication plays an important role. A society does not sustain itself, but rests on the pillar of tolerance, as John Locke used to say, letters concerning toleration for those with a different religion, because creed could not be imposed. And we can see this in the context of the matter that we're discussing today. Tolerance cannot be seen as an absolute term because it can clash with another important pillar of democratic societies, that is freedom of expression. Freedom of expression is a very wide right in Western societies, and this is a basic guarantee of democracy. In order to have free public opinion, that is a pre-requirement. Through communication and the transmission of messages and discourse, we are creating an imaginary, a collective imaginary all share, and we're also individual imaginary, the one each of us has. Through that, we're creating stereotypes, categories, as we were mentioning before. And those stereotypes and categories are discriminating, and they even endanger the dignity of human beings. What's concerning is not that we're part of a society that is traversed by classical structures that favor the imposition of a gender binary system, but more often than not, this exclusion and discrimination through speech can turn into aggression, hate speech, or even violence as such. In the face of these expressions, we have to go back to respect to diversity as per the Declaration of Principles on Tolerance of UNESCO of 1995. And this is a limit, this justifies the establishment of limits that may help combine exercising freedom of expression with other constitutionally protected rights such as dignity. There are many examples of hate speech, of transphobia, of social media, homophobia. I've just brought a couple of images. I'll try to share the screen with you quite fast. I hope it works. Just a couple of examples. We have the first transgender Miss Spain. She was subjected to jokes and derision through social media. These are insulting messages and images that have been disseminated. And she was the target of these messages. Some of them are discriminating, and some others consolidate stereotypes, the already existing stereotypes. Let me stop sharing the screen because I just wanted to show you those pictures. We can discuss whether the content of these messages or these images can be understood as hate speech, and we know that this is different from hate crimes. This is something that we should not make a mistake with, but we can maybe think they're just jokes and they should be under freedom of expression. But this is a matter of content. But not only, there's another interesting aspect that is the channel, the platform through which this content is disseminated, and how this channel becomes fundamental because it has consequences that place the receivers, actually the targets, in a vulnerable position, especially when we speak about a channel that amplifies dissemination of this content to an extent that was unthinkable of a few years ago. Any of us can think, we can imagine ourselves doing whatever, having some coffee with our mobile phone in our hand, and we having a look at our social media, and we see some of this content of the examples of the examples we've seen in other presentations today. So we may see content that might have hundreds of comments that has been retweeted and that has been shared. Sometimes we just look at it, and sometimes we share it, and we are part of this exponential chain, multiplication chain of that message. It is true that internet as a channel, as a transmission channel of speech and messages is not new. We know that we have some studies about the effects of the digital era, and we have studies since the 1990s with Manuel Castells, who described it as a society in a network. But I'd like to highlight some specific features of this digital scenario, which is not new, but it has become generalized now. And we have some specific traces that are compelling in the effects that they have, and in terms of the consequences that have to do with the transmission of these hate messages or aggression messages that may lead to violence. It is true that the content of those messages, and it's essential in terms of labeling something as hate speech, and our colleague Victor Vázquez, our Professor Ana Valero, are also part of the project, and many others have mentioned how important this is, the subjective element and the intent to discriminate in those messages. I do think that we need to look at the channel and the specific features of the channel that have to be introduced and have to be considered legally, because the legal approach to freedom of expression cannot forget the effects linked to the channel through which these messages are being disseminated. I think that in order to classify these effects, we first should have a classification and have first objective elements. Those are those that are related to the channel itself or to the platform, and on the other hand, subjective elements. And this helps us categorize and classify these things, I think, positively in this sense. If we look at the objective elements, the most important one is the capacity to disseminate a message. That is, these messages have a wider reach, and we can see that in 3 different dimensions. First, social media platforms and such as dissemination channels reach farther in terms of physical distance. At the same time, they also have a personal subjective reach because they reach a higher number of people. It reaches further and also more people. And it also has a temporal scope because these content is stored online. So they are digital archives, they're stored and they're there, and they're going to remain there unless we do something about it. So the reach of these messages also have an impact on its repercussion, and this is something that has to be thought about when we look at the legislation or the legal framework when we're thinking about hate speech and when it clashes with other rights such as freedom of expression, and when we think about equality and non-discrimination. On the other hand, we also have to think about the features of the social network itself in which we're working. And because those that allow to disseminate content, discourse, for example, Facebook or Twitter, are the ones that have a larger capacity to do that. And there are conflicts here with freedom of expression, although WhatsApp and Telegram allow this, but this is more of a private usage of groups of friends. And this helps share content. And then we have a different group, including Instagram and YouTube, that they also produce clashes of this kind, but they're mostly audiovisual content, so the nature of conflict is different too. So this is the first element, the outreach. And the second element is universal access. That is access generalized for anybody who has the technology available, so we can disseminate content and messages from any part of the world. And we can also combine we can delink the sender and the recipient. So the distance is blurred, and this leads us directly to the subjective elements involved in this new channel, new communication channel, and the digital era. This has to do with the actors participating in communication. As I was saying, distance is blurred, and also the profile of the creator of the content is blurred. Usually in the past, this was somebody who had access to the press, to media, but now they have the channel to do that. Nowadays, any citizen can disseminate content, they can publish things on social media, they can share their opinions. So this is something we need to think about and consider. And then the profiles. Profiles on social media can have a physical person who are entitled to rights, or might not have a physical person behind them, an individual. I was discussing this with Victor. Bots, for example, are not entitled to fundamental rights. A bot is not entitled to freedom of expression. And this is something important because most of the content, discriminatory content, hate speech, and fake news that perpetuate these stereotypes that are interesting for us, most of this content is created automatically. And this automated creation of content is something that we need to consider. This cannot be under the right to freedom of expression, as there's nobody entitled to it behind it. If we look at the effects, I do not want to go into all the details so that we can have a discussion afterwards. And hopefully we will be in a position to discuss up to what extent we can use the patterns of the framework of freedom of expression with considering these changes in channels that amplify their effects and these messages. So these limits are applied to freedom of expression. One of them is hate speech. Though sometimes it is difficult to define. The Council of Europe has defined it as all forms of expression that spread, incite, promote, or justify racial hatred, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, or other forms of hatred based on intolerance to minorities. This is the definition that has also been used by the European Court of Human Rights, and that it applies through two pathways. First, with a clause of abuse of Article 17, abuse of rights. So when they assign the label hate speech to these messages, and others with the ponderation option of Article 10. I have a couple of cases to share with you, case law. We have the sentence of the ECHR of 9 February 2012, a Wetline and others against Sweden. This is a case in which there was some pamphlets being distributed in a high school claiming that homosexuality was the main reason for the transmission of HIV, and they also said that homosexuality was a deviation that had a destructive moral effect on Swedish society. And the ECHR claimed that there is no direct call for violence against homosexuals, but it says that they do call for hatred, and the discrimination based on sexual orientation is as severe as that based on race, origin, or color. So the ECHR does not support this type of speech, and they denied protection to these pamphlets because they thought that they were an aggression towards homosexuals, and it considered it hate speech under Article 10 of their convention. This also shows the distance we see in the European model and the North American model in terms of free speech. We know that in Europe, the efforts have been focusing on trying to avoid the dissemination of these types of messages. Well, in the US, the First Amendment actually covers freedom of expression for any kind of speech. So it is difficult to find case law where this is restricted. We have as an example the case Snyder versus Phelps. In this case, the court revoked the sentence that condemned demonstrators who, during the funeral of a Marine who had died in the war of Iraq, the demonstrators started shouting against homosexuality in the armed forces and against homosexuals. The High Court thought that this was part of a topic of public interest, and that this was separated from the funeral, and they thought that this was spoken speech and that it was protected by the First Amendment. So they protected this type of speech. We have a more recent case of 2020. Again, the ECHR 14th January 2020. This is homophobic hate through internet and social media. And the court condemned Lithuania for not investigating a claim that they have received regarding comments and threats against homosexuals on social media that could incite violence. So in this case, the court thinks that the sexual orientation of the victims was what prevented the authorities from investigating the case. So Lithuania was going against the duty to investigate cases of potential discrimination according to Article 13 of the Convention. I've been very brief in discussing these cases. but they all analyze content. They analyze the content of these speeches. They can be included as hate speech or not, or help us limit freedom of expression or not. We can discuss what the best standard for the protection of minorities could be, and those groups who are affected by these claims without forsaking freedom of expression. But I'd like to leave some questions for the debate here. I'm interested in the question of to what extent the way we legally conceive freedom of expression are conditioned by this new channel and this new era of digital communication, and how this has an impact on discriminatory content when these images become viral through social media. I've always spoke of the reach that a meme can have on social media or a tweet, and I think that at this point we could logically apply the doctrine of the Spanish Constitutional Court regarding the headlines of the written press. The Constitutional Court understands that the headline has more impact than the body of the news itself, because many former readers access the headline and its impact is higher. So we can see that also applied to a tweet. This is a short message, and it has a very important, high capacity to impact and to reach others. So the repercussion is huge. And when the repercussion and the consequences of the speech change, then we should change the legal frameworks. And if we go back to Sustain, he says that internet is not just an effective medium to preserve and promote democratic principles, it's also a powerful tool to undermine them. So we have the two sides of the coin. We have this tool that produces, that perpetuates stereotypes and discrimination and foster violence, but it can also become a tool for the opposite, to disseminate tolerance, to respect diversity. And we can see social media as an opportunity to deconstruct those categories that divide us and to build a different kind of speech. Thank you.